Welcome to Classical Etc., a show that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
So on today's episode, I want to talk with you all, three teachers I admire, about the idea of being a teacher. I was reflecting about this before we started the episode. Maybe you guys disagree with this. I'd be interested to hear, especially Paul, that if you think about jobs that people do today, there's probably a lot of jobs that people do today that didn't exist 100, 200 years ago. But if there's out of the handful of jobs that have been out there for a very, very long time, being a teacher is one of them. One of the kind of universal human roles that people have filled throughout time. And so I'm really intrigued by just that idea of what is a teacher, specifically what is a teacher in the classical education world, and what does it mean to be a teacher?
What?
So to start this conversation, I want to ask each of you individually, how did you end up being a teacher? None of you that I'm aware of have education degrees, but you are all teachers. So Martin, starting with you, how did you end up as a teacher?
Well, I was working in education policy for a number of years, and then that actually got me interested in education. And then a friend came to me and wanted to start a school. And so I started thinking about it, and I thought that'd be a really good idea. I didn't know I was going to become the first and only teacher at that particular point in time. And so I just started doing it and wasn't very good, I think, at the beginning. It is something you do have to work into and use as practice and experience, you know. That's the only way, I think, to become a good teacher and to watch good teachers teach. I mean, that's, imitation, which is a classical mode of learning, really. So I was doing it wholesale and then decided I wanted to do it retail and it took a while to do well. It just, and really most of that was just knowing how to relate to young people because if you're not teaching, you're usually not in an environment where you're relating to young people. And that is an art that you have to learn. And it took me a few years to learn that.
Your self-awareness about that growth is pretty interesting, and I want to double back to that. But before we do that, Tanya, how did you end up being a teacher?
Cheryl Lowe. This is a crazy story. My son was in her Latin class and told me over and over that he couldn't do his homework because he didn't understand it. So I asked her if I could sit in just enough to figure out what he was doing so that he couldn't use that excuse with me. So she gladly let me in, and I stayed for 2 years. And then she asked me the first year that she had enough students to have each grade, she asked me if I would consider teaching, and I literally laughed in her face. I said, I majored in English the first time, and then I didn't want to teach, which was all you could do with an English degree. So I went back and got my accounting degree. And at that point, I had a tax business in the small town that we lived in, and I was doing 700 tax returns a year and working really hard. And I just thought, I'm going to go teach for you. I don't want to teach. There's nothing that I never thought I wanted to teach. And then after tax season that spring, I was in my tax office. I could literally take you back to where I was standing. I'd gone from my desk to make copies, and I was halfway back, and I just stood there. All of a sudden, I just stopped and thought, I think I'll teach, which was just crazy. It was crazy. These things don't really happen very often where God literally turned your thought process to, it was like I had no choice. And when I told my husband, he was like, hang on, so you're gonna not do taxes anymore, where we were making, I was making a pretty good living, to go work in a cottage school 2 days a week, which is going to cut your income a lot. And I said, yeah, I think I am. And so I went to Cheryl and said, I think I'm going to do this. So I observed Lee teaching one day, and I sold the tax business, and she handed me all these books and said, we don't have any curriculum. You're going to have to write it this summer. So I went to my mom's on the beach and sat on the beach and wrote all those study guides or on her porch and worked hard all summer. The whole time I was terrified and thinking, what are you doing? You're not a teacher. You don't know how to teach. You've never taught except in Sunday school. And this is nuts. But it was like I didn't have a choice. And so, and the whole time, she was mentoring me. And so the first day of school, I was terrified. And I walked in there having no clue what to do, really, except, she had guided me some and I had watched Lee teach. And it was one of the best days of my life. I mean, I was just euphoric. It felt so good. And I never looked back. I just loved every second of it. And it makes no sense. If you had asked me whether I would have ended up in a classroom teaching little children, I would have said there was no way.
It's a great story. At what point do you think that you kind of changed your mindset and were like, I'm a teacher?
Well, it kind of happened without my mindset. And I felt like from that very first day that I was a teacher. Now, I had to work very hard because I'm a perfectionist. And so for everything I was teaching, so I was teaching the Middle Ages. And so I bought every remaindered book. Every time I would find a remaindered book at Barnes & Noble or Holly Cook, and I would buy it and put it on a shelf. And whenever I had to teach, so I would spend all weekend prepping. I spent all summer learning about the Middle Ages, I was only teaching famous men of the Middle Ages. It was really kind of nuts, but this is the way I do things. Sure. And so I was really prepared to teach. But as far as learning the pedagogy, and of course I had Cheryl as my example. I sat in her class for 2 years as a student. And that helped me a lot, how to use the board. I figured all that out because I had sat at her feet. And so that did help me. But I never really had a point where I thought, oh, wow, now you can do this. I was constantly still working on it. Even when I wasn't teaching anymore, I was still, some things worked, some things didn't. And we were a new school too. So we were figuring it out together. And that did help. Yeah. Not to have to go into an established school with all these teachers who knew what they were doing.
Right.
We were just kind of a mess, really, in those years.
So, Paul, how about you?
Well, I was sitting there trying to think about the first time I taught, and then I realized that when I was in 7th grade, my mother sent me to this one room. Well, it's really 2-room because Mom taught kindergarten through 2nd grade. And then the other teacher who was starting school taught 3rd grade through, I guess, 7th grade because I was the oldest. And because she had 3rd through 7th grade, she couldn't teach math to everybody. And so she'd be like, all right, Paul, here, go teach Patrick, 4th grader, go teach him math. Because, at that point, I should know that because it was 3 years behind, And I don't know. It's just, I grew up sort of in that environment of just, somebody needs to learn something. You just tell them what to do. Never really seemed to be a big deal to me. And then, after high school and college, it would be similar things where they'd just be like, here, go teach this class. And at the school where I'm studying, and I'm like, okay. And then when I decided to move home from Italy back to Kentucky, my dad was like, what are you going to do? I was like, I have no idea. Absolutely no idea. And he said, why don't you ask Cheryl Lowe if you can teach Latin? And he's like, when she taught you, that's grown into a school. Maybe she's got something for you. And I was like, great. It was going to be a 1-year deal in my mind. It was a 1-year deal. And it was just so that I could get my feet underneath me and figure out what I wanted to do. And I never left. And I mean, it's the first year teaching at Highlands. Now, at that point, we were teaching, our periods were an hour and a half long for upper school, 7th grade and up. And I just remember being absolutely exhausted after every class. I was doing the same thing Tanya was doing. I was using Dorothy Mill's books, but I was going to Books A Million or Barnes & Noble or whatever and finding, other things and buying those and reading more. And I'd get up there and it was so exciting to see the lights going off in those kids' heads. And I love that 7th, 8th grade range because they're coming into their own. Some of them don't want to talk, but if you can get them to talk, then you can really have some fun. And you can see the transition from grammar school to high school just happening in front of your eyes. And so, I had a lot of fun, but at the end of every hour and a half long period, I'm like, I need a break because it was, we were digging so much into it, but it was so rewarding. You could just see those kids changing. But at the same time, lest we paint a rosy picture, my 7th grade boys class, I had a chair of frustration. And that was for me, not for the kids. I didn't put the kids in the chair of frustration. It wasn't like a dunce cap. It was when I knew they knew it, but it wasn't having a good day. And I'd just pull out the chair and I'd say, guys, I need 10 seconds. And I'd sit down and they're like, oh, dang it. We've disappointed Mr. Shaeffer. And then I stand back up and they're like, okay. And I was like, we ready? And then they'd be on track, but it was, small things like that just kind of happen naturally depending on the group. And we, it was just something that was fun.
Yeah. So I have a pretty limited teacher experience compared to you guys, but I also came to be a teacher through a kind of a circuitous route. I had taught a fair amount in non-school traditions before I got to my time at Memoria Press. But I've kind of lived my life with a philosophy that I would call the stand by the huddle philosophy. And that is, if you know anything about football, that even if you have no talent and no size like me, if you stand next to the huddle, there's going to come a time where the coach grabs the nearest guy with a helmet and throws him onto the field.
What's a huddle?
It's the area that people stand. It's the little group of players that people stand in on football, where they decide who's going to play on the field.
Oh, I didn't even know that happened. I thought they knew who played.
It actually doesn't in a lot of teams anymore.
Yeah, now the huddle is less popular, but you're ruining my metaphor. So anyway,
sorry.
As a lowly editor at Memoria Press, one day they were walking through saying, we need a substitute for composition. Who can do it? And I was like, me? And they're like, why? And I'm like, I can do it. I'll do it. And I got thrown in and I've been teaching at the cottage school ever since. So, but I've really enjoyed it. It's been a really awesome time. So one thing that's come out of each of y'all's answers to this question has been this thought process of, as you took the position, there was areas where you needed to grow, that you didn't go in as fully formed teachers. What are some of the things that you would identify as ways that you grew as a teacher to become better? And what were the things that took you there?
The thing that takes you there is just trial and error. And your poor children have to suffer when you make mistakes. You may try a project that you think, well, this is a great use of time, and it's not. And that was the hardest thing for me was trying to be creative, stick with the curriculum, but also I knew that time on task was very important. And so if I felt like I had wasted time by trying something that really just didn't work, then that for me was a failure. And just learning how to discipline, how to love them, but control them at the same time. Every now and then you would get a class that is just a teacher killer class where you forget why you're teaching because you're just so worn down by trying to control that class, and you can't make a joke and you can't have any kind of levity at all, or you lose control. And then the next year you start in with your new class and you think, oh yeah, this is why I'm doing this, because I love it. But you forget that sometimes. A class can really change everything. As good a teacher as you are, sometimes that class can kill you.
When learning to relate to students, how much of that would you ascribe to your own kind of emotional intelligence, people skills that is innate, and how much was it that you were observing other teachers doing it well and you were picking up things here and there from other people?
Well, I would say, I had a huge advantage when I started at Highlands because I was half the time working for Highlands, half the time working for Memoria Press. And one of my projects for Memoria Press was trying to tape classes so we'd have some example classes to show, which never saw the light of day. But I got to go into those classrooms and watch. Mm-hmm. And so I would spend a lot of time watching classes. And I remember that's when like my eyes opened about the magic that's worked in kindergarten, first and second grades, because there is no way I could teach. I don't believe I could teach a child to read. The child needs to come to me already knowing how to read. But it was, it was magical. Like I watched it. I know the techniques now because I sat there and watched it, but it also gave me this vision of, okay, this is what these kids have been through. So this is what I can expect of them. And watching those teachers teach was huge to me.
I really think that's the best way to train a teacher.
And I spent a lot of time in sixth grade. I was teaching 7th and 8th grade. Spent a lot of time in sixth grade because I could see, okay, this is what they had last year. And so I knew exactly what to expect. That was huge too, because I was watching a veteran teacher teach sixth grade who and I knew that I could imitate those things and expect the same results.
The reason I asked the question is because I feel like we encounter a lot of times people who are saying this teacher is just really gifted as a teacher and this teacher is not. And so they maybe give up hope on that teacher. But it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a lot of growth that can happen just through observation.
Oh, a lot.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And you can't give up on a teacher. You have to eventually you may have to. And hopefully they see by that time when you are giving up on them that it's not a fit. But most of the time, you can bring a teacher along. Not everybody can go into a classroom and just be a natural teacher. There is a huge learning curve to it, but observing other teachers and also, as Paul said, knowing what came before, what the students know, and what comes after, what they need to know when they leave your classroom. All of that is so important. That continuity among class to class to class, that's huge in a school.
But Shane, I'd like to draw a distinction here, though. When it comes to like learning to be a teacher, you've really got two things going on. One is just like classroom management and pedagogy, and the other was just content. And so, I've seen times where it's a bad administrative decision that we've put somebody who knows Greek to go teach a Latin class, an upper level Latin class that, he just doesn't know the content well enough to get that to the students. Doesn't matter whether he's a good classroom manager, he just doesn't know the content, sure. Right? And, hopefully, right? A veteran teacher could pick that up and go, okay, well, I can just stay ahead in the content, right? But if you have a new teacher who is having to struggle with the pedagogy and the classroom management and having to learn the content, that can get overwhelming and they don't have enough to give of themselves.
And in our lower school, when the teacher has to teach every subject, so you have to know so much going in. And we started a few years ago having our teachers fill out the study guides that their students would be using in the summer. So they actually have been through the curriculum. Sure. It forces them through the curriculum. And that is huge. If you go in and don't have the content, then it's just you're going to be miserable. Right. But if you can go in confident, knowing that you know more than you have to teach, and it's a lot of work. It is hard work to be a teacher. It's the most underpaid, hardest job in the world.
Martin, how about you? You talked about your own growth and your own feeling that you didn't start out as a fully formed teacher. Can you isolate some of the things that you grew in and how you got better as a teacher?
Well, I did have the one advantage. I had worked in public policy, and I was a communications person. Messaging, legislative strategy. Writing press releases. I've probably written 2,000 press releases in my lifetime. And so I did have that advantage of having a basic understanding of how you communicate with people. But then when you get in the environment, you have to take account of your audience, and it is a different kind of audience. And I'm dealing with mostly middle schoolers and high schoolers. And you have to be the most confident person in the room. You have to be the smartest person in the room. You have to be the funniest person in the room. You have to be ahead of them on everything. And that's hard to do.
And you can't contradict yourself.
And you can't. They will catch you out.
Yep.
And so just mastering those three rhetorical skills, ethos, logos, and pathos. They have to believe that you know what you're doing ethos. They have to have confidence in you, and they will find your weaknesses if they can. And you have to know your stuff, logos, and you have to be able to present it in an attractive way, pathos. So that's something that you can't ever learn how to do without just plain doing it. And you have to have kind of an ideal in your mind of what a good teacher is. And I realized after many years that there were elements of Mr. Hall, my history teacher in high school, who'd draw on the board and he'd get to the edge of the board and he'd just keep going on the brick on the wall. And he had this winsomeness, and then teachers like my Spanish teacher who taught a very grammar-based Spanish course. And I was not a good student in high school, but I got A's in her class because it was such a well-organized class. So there's a little bit of that too in terms of the assignments and how all that goes. There's so many factors to it, but you do have to have some innate skills coming in, and then you just have to develop those on some model, whether it's explicit or implicit in your mind about what a good teacher is.
Shane, can I do your job for a second?
Yeah.
So
always.
Thank you. Earlier,
I'm only taking questions from Shane.
Well, I'll ask it. You can deny it if you want to. Earlier, you mentioned how you didn't know how to relate to kids early on, right? Because you'd worked in adult settings, and then you came into the class. And
I was legislator, so it wasn't that far from children.
But then you also said that you had to be the smartest, the funniest, And I think a struggle for young people, I was 23 when I started teaching at Highlands, and it's a common struggle where you're going from being the student to being the teacher, and you still perceive yourself as one of the students, as a really young teacher. And you had to learn to relate because you were solidly in the adult camp. Now, how do I get these younger kids to relate to me? Where I think a lot of brand new teachers are having the opposite struggle of how do I become the adult in the room?
Especially if they look as young as the students.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's kind of a mix of both because, or particularly when you're doing literature, you're teaching literature or something like that, and you're discussing things in class, you are in a way, a searcher just like them. And so that it's a trick that you have to pull to be both the leader and also with them in discovering something that you may not even have known until some student brought it up, and so you have to value their contributions and yet still be the teacher and the authority in the room, which it can be hard to do.
Yeah, it is very hard. I remember when I was teaching philosophy, I think even this happened in 7th and 8th grade too. We'd have a discussion, I'd be throwing stuff up on the board, and somebody talking about not contradicting yourself would say, well, Mr. Shaeffer, you said this and that. How do those two things go together? And there'd be enough on the board, and I'd say, well, let's think about it and let's contemplate. And I'd go and I would stand in the back of the room alongside the back row for a minute or two and just say, all right, and I would give them silence. Let's contemplate this. We've talked about this. All right, now who has an answer for that? Right. And instead of it just being, you're talking about that being that searcher as well. And in philosophy, they would stump me. Sometimes would be like, I need to come back to this.
Yeah, but you have to kind of let go a little bit too. I cannot count the number of times teaching a short story or a poem or something, and I'm looking at the thing just like they are, and I see something I did not see before, or some student points something out, I'm going, oh my gosh. And if you are very straightforward in saying, that is a really good observation. You're betraying that you did not see that before, which is kind of putting you in a vulnerable position. But you just valued something that they said or saw, and it's mind blowing, and you start investigating that. Look at what so and so said here. Did everyone hear what he just said? And they like that, and you're co-searchers for truth.
I think you're pointing to the fact that it's very hard to be truly honest as a teacher if you're not also extremely hardworking.
Right, and you have to be honest because they can spot fakeness a mile away, and if you're not sincere, they know it.
And if you don't know your stuff, and
right.
if you know your stuff and you're really confident, then when they do point something out that you've not thought about, it's very easy to say, that is great.
Yeah.
And I haven't thought about that before.
Right. Otherwise, they sense that insecurity.
Yeah. And I mean, there's the saying, fake it till you make it, right? But that faking it till you make it, right, is you have to have that confidence, but you also have to be able to admit, I don't know that I'm going to come back to you tomorrow or whatever it is, or that's an amazing insight that I didn't see.
And if they ask you a question that you're stumped by, you just say, that is a really good question. That's such a good question. I mean, thought of that question. I mean, that, make them feel good about it. Yeah. And then they don't sense any insecurity. You're being honest, and they respect that.
Yeah. So I want to go around the table and ask you guys each, what are the things that you liked about teaching the most and the things you disliked about teaching the most? And hopefully we get a couple of war stories out of this as well. So, Paul, do you want to start?
I've kind of already said, I've highlighted the thing that I liked was just seeing those light bulbs go off in their faces, because you can see it when all of a sudden they put two things together. All of a sudden they're no longer thinking in a concrete way. They're starting to think more abstractly. And what are the ideas in this text? That's very exciting to me. I love middle school because it was like, in some ways, it was throwing them in the deep end of the pool, and every single one of them was like, wait, I know I've been taught to swim, but I've never actually swam. Is that right? Swam? I can never figure that one out.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I know the answer.
So, and then you get to see, all these kids out there swimming that, at the beginning of the year, they didn't think they could. Yeah. I loved that. I'm just going to take the easy thing I hated doing was grading.
There you go.
But honestly, I don't think I can complain because here at Highlands, we are very reasonable about the amount of evaluation that needs to be done.
Sure.
Right. And it can be done in a lot of different ways. So it's not like every day you're going home with a stack this thick of papers.
Unless you teach sixth grade.
Well,
and then you've got a stack of papers from every class.
Well, yes, but you might get that. Are you getting that every day?
No, but you're getting, it's a lot. It is a lot of grading. I think we would all agree grading just really stinks.
But I'm just saying there are schools that say you have to have this amount of assessments. And I've gone to train at those schools and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't even know how
are we going to get this grade?
Right.
Because we don't have those tests built in regularly enough.
Right.
Yes.
There is a lot of grading, but but compared to what other people experience.
But then K-2 doesn't have to grade at all because they don't give homework except for Prima Latina tests.
Those kindergarten teachers are so lucky.
I know. That's but then I think, could I be it? No way am I teaching a child to read and write. That just their day itself to me sounds really scary. But then they get to go home at night and have their evening.
Yeah. I'm not saying that primary teachers have an easy job. Tanya is. I just want the record to show that.
I did not say that. I said they didn't have to grade papers, but I think they've got the hardest job in the world. Their children actually don't know how to use a Kleenex sometimes.
Right.
So I guess I would trade and take the homework.
So Tanya, what about you? What do you love about teaching?
I would agree with Paul that just inspiring passion in the students and watching that happen is just the most fun thing. And just having a great discussion together, seeing those light bulbs go on. I mean, that's why you're there, right? And that is absolutely, when I taught Anne of Green Gables, I was determined the first time I taught it that the boys were going to love it, or at least just like it. And so I read the first chapter and I was very dramatic and really talked about Anne and her personality. And we were about, a third of the way through the book, and we were having a break, and it was during our lit class, and they were having a restroom break, and a couple of the boys in the middle of the classroom were sitting there chatting, and they said, and one of them said, "So what do you think about Anne?" And the other one said, "She's all right." And I thought, I've done it. I mean, that to me was enough. That was
That's
enough. But I worked really hard for them to like Anne, because my own son did not like Anne, and it just broke my heart. And I just thought, I can make these boys like Anne of Green Gables. Of course, the girls just loved it. So, I mean, that for me was the thing, was just that experience with those children. And the thing I think the hardest thing about teaching is, besides the grading, but really is it's very isolating. Mm-hmm. And so as a teacher, you spend every workday in a classroom with a bunch of kids. And it's very hard to get teachers together on a regular basis. There's no time for that, really. I mean, they might have a 20-minute break for PE or choir or something like that, but even in the lunchroom, they're sitting with their students. So I find that difficult, not to be able to have adult conversations through the day, and just to we're all doing the same thing, but we're all doing it in separate rooms. So there's not that immediate camaraderie that you get in an office setting. And so to me, that was a difficult thing, is I wanted to be with those other adults and talk about what we had done. And that's hard to do.
Martin?
Well, it's just, I think it's the meeting of minds that you get, particularly in a with older students, when you're talking about some idea or something in a story or something, and you all see it at once, and then you hear the kids after class, and they're walking out, and one of the boys says to another one, "That was incredible." That when they point, they're talking about it as they go out. That just, if you're teaching things that you yourself value, and you can pass on that passion to your students, that is the most fulfilling thing, is to see that same passion in them, and that you were able to excite that. There's nothing like that.
Yeah, I had a teacher who I really loved, who a couple of times, he really influenced me a lot. So a couple of times I tried to tell him how much I thought he was great and that he'd influenced me. And every time he looked so embarrassed, and he'd look at me and be like, yeah. And it didn't occur to me till later that he was like, "I'm not the thing that's interesting. Mm-hmm. The thing that's interesting is the stuff we've been talking about." Mm-hmm. And that's what, I've always
he brought it alive.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I would suggest next time, write your compliments. Yeah. That was one of the things that I looked forward to the most, were thank you notes at the end of the semester of the year. And you could tell kids that were just doing it because their parents made them, but you could tell the kids that were like, this legitimately has touched me. Mm. And, I keep all of those. Sorry, students. Yes, I do keep them. And because it's nice to go back and look at those again and go, oh my goodness, like that year, it was tough, but, I have proof that at least, a quarter of the class walked out being touched, and you trust that you touched the other ones too, but, just like it was 10 lepers. No, those lepers. The ones
where one comes back to say thank you. Yes.
He comes back to say thank you. And so you trust all the other ones got cured too, but the one I see, the one that comes back and says thank you, that for me was a huge part of teaching.
Mm. And when you get to be an older teacher and you have some student who you haven't seen for 15, 20 years, and at this point in my life, and you've kind of a lot of times forgotten them, and I was in your class, and then you remember who this is, and they said, your class was so good, and I just want you to know, it's the same kind of thing. And, after all that time, they're still thinking about your class. I mean, that's pretty good stuff.
So switching gears a little bit, we work a lot with homeschool families and people that are using curriculum at home. And a lot of times the mom and dad in those families are teachers. What advice do you have for homeschooling parents as they think about being teachers? Maybe Tanya, start with you.
I found that so difficult. I really tried to instill passion in my own children at home. And they just were never that excited about anything that I had to say in a way that they were when they were in Martin's class or classical studies. And I would stand outside the door and hear the class laughing and the teacher laughing because they had talked about some great funny thing that had happened in the Iliad I couldn't do that with it was hard I couldn't, I couldn't lecture them in a way that it's just a whole different thing. I felt like I could do it in my classroom of students. And I did teach my 5th grader. But at home, it just is a different dynamic. And so I do think that the discussion is important, but it's different than I think of teaching as it's really like a performance, which is why you're exhausted at the end of it because you are up with an audience. At home, they're your children, you're sitting around the dining room table, and it's just different. But I do think you've got to have the discussions with them. It's just more one-on-one. You have to talk about what they've read and really try to do your best to bring it alive for them. But really, that hybrid situation that I had my children in, where they would go 1 day a week and then 2 days a week, that was ideal because then they were accountable to somebody else. If I said, you need to get your logic homework done, then it didn't have the weight that it did when I said, you're going to class tomorrow and Mr. Cothran is going to expect you to have your logic homework done. It was nice to have them accountable to somebody else. They were terrible logic students, weren't they?
Not particularly. Maybe not the best. It is really hard, and this is where number one, I think the father's involvement helps, and online classes outside, particularly when they get older, help because they do that outside accountability is really important because they've heard mom saying that they want this and mom's let it go a few times and they're counting on you to let it go this time. And, so online courses I think are really helpful in this regard. But if I can come from the other side of this, and that is a lot of homeschooling mothers are becoming teachers. I spoke I was listening to a talk at a conference, and there was a professor talking about how, we need to teach Latin. It was about Latin and how important it is to teach Latin. And one of the ladies stood up afterwards in the question and answer period. She said, we'd love to teach Latin in our school, but we can't find Latin teachers. And after she got done, I raised my hand and I said, wait about 5 or 10 years because you're going to have all these homeschooling mothers who taught First Form or Henley Latin or something. And they're going to know Latin now because they've taught their kids Latin, and they're going to be knocking on your doors at your schools. And so just fairly recently, we had one of our Classical Latin School Association schools, the headmaster called me and said, we just lost our advanced Latin teacher. Do you know of any Latin teachers in Florida? I don't know a single Latin teacher in Florida. I don't know if there are any Latin teachers in Florida. But I said, have you checked with your local homeschool group? But the next day she had a teacher replacement for him who had taught through Henley. And she was better than the teacher she had. Oh. She wasn't a certified teacher or anything, but she knew the material and she was good. And you're going to be seeing a whole lot more of that kind of thing is these homeschooling mothers who know the material now. They've taught their own children and they're going to be a whole lot better fit than I was to learn how to teach well in a classroom.
Well, and the online academy is offering adult Latin classes. So,
Can we play your theme music for your commercial right now too?
Right.
Any other advice from you, Paul? Aside from enroll your students in the online academy.
Is this just general teacher advice? I lost track.
For homeschooling families.
Oh, I would echo what Tanya said. I mean, I was trying to think of my experience being homeschooled, and the one thing I remember is the one subject that mom was passionate about, which was catechism. That's the one thing I remember about that. You know, I mean, she was able to communicate passion there in a way that, you know, she didn't have to communicate passion to me in literature. Because, I mean, we still talk about the fact that I would read anything I could get my hands on. I mean, I was just a voracious reader. So she didn't, you know, and when I started going to school when I was in 6th grade. So up through 5th grade, it wasn't like a whole lot of discussion going on. It was just, let's read it, let's talk about it, or let's, you know, make sure you understood what was going on and move on. So, but that passion, somehow she was able to do that. And so that's from the student perspective, you know, looking back at it, that's where as a teacher, I realized if I don't show my passion in a school setting, they're not going to pick it up. They're just not going to be engaged. And, you know, as Tanya said, it's hard to show that passion. Sure. It is in a homeschool setting, but
it is. And some of the passion I found with my own children at home was inspired listening to each other. So the first student does the Iliad. The second student's listening to us talk about it, listening to us, you know, get ready for tests and all of that stuff. So then the second student comes along and does it, and then they talk among themselves. I really think the best conversations we had were when they were both involved at the same time, because they had that shared experience.
Well, and this is the thing too, and you know what Paul said about loving literature. You know, I know some homeschoolers, and the program they're doing is not literature rich, and their students don't have any passion for it. And it's like you need to make your children into readers. And one of the ways of doing that is reading to them. I think this is just a huge thing. And my wife will say to this day, you know, that her favorite memories are, you know, sitting around the dining room table after everyone's finished, and I read the story, you know, Betsy Tasty, when Betsy makes everything stew and it tastes terrible, and all the funny things in those stories. Those were ways of bringing our family together, and my kids loved that. They loved being read to, and my grandkids love being read to. So I think that that has to be, I think, at the center of any homeschool, is reading to your children. And my wife would do it in the middle of the day when she's reading the Bible to them during their homeschooling day. The little ones are being read a picture book before bedtime. Dad is reading to the whole family after eating. When you push the dishes back and you just
that would make me a nervous wreck. I'd be up doing the dishes while you read.
Well, and it, you know, also you don't have to any effort in that regard can have a big influence. I don't remember. I mean, I'm sure my parents did some reading to us, and I only remember one book Mom read. I think she went through trying to do this, and she did it like 2 or 3 books, and then it kind of faded out from my memory. My sisters would probably correct me, but the one book I remember is Cheaper by the Dozen.
Oh yes,
and you know, but you know, we all grew into readers. And so even if as a homeschooling parent, you say, well, doing that every night, that sounds tough. Well, just try one. Mm-hmm. And if that's all you get to, that's all you get to, but that may have an impact.
Yeah. I think books at the center of this enterprise. My grandkids, they all love books, physical books. They have bookshelves, and they have their favorite, and they're arranging their books on their bookshelves, something you can't do with a Kindle. There's it's got to be an essential part of your home culture.
Yeah, so there's hope for homeschool families to take the job of teaching seriously.
Oh goodness, yes, yes, and so many are doing that. Right. They're doing such a good job, and it's hard. You know, and the more children you have, I think the harder it is. But it is so worth doing. Yeah. And it does. I mean, reading is at the center of it. I was so fortunate that my husband heard on, I think, NPR, somebody say that only 10% of men read to their children. And at that point, he said, because I was the one who always read to them. I was the one home in the daytime. I read to them before bed. He said, I'm going to start reading to them before bed every night, which totally freed me. I did not stay in the room with them. They would go to their bedroom, they would get in bed, and he would read every night. And they did that, till they were almost adults.
Yeah, and this is important because a lot of fathers feel lost in terms of what their role is.
That's right.
How can they be
Because he
teachers?
had no
Is
clue what
their
we were
role.
doing for school.
That
I
is
was
their
I was controlling that.
One other thing, but going back to what Tanya was saying about sort of intentionality and preparation in the classroom, the way my mother did this, and we still give her grief, but there was no game in the house that wasn't educational. Like we played board games and everything, but Monopoly, okay, because you have to be counting your money, you got to be doing a lot of math. Okay, fine. Scrabble, okay, you're working on your spelling, working on your words, fine. But
What about Candyland? We do Candyland.
We had Candyland, but it was when we were, it was still in the closet when I was older, but when we were 4, 5, 6 and learning our numbers, it was a great way to learn to count. Roll your dice, count,
Math.
etc.
You're teaching your grandchildren math.
But I remember being like 11 or 12 and somebody brought us a game, which the only redeeming quality about it was the counting the spaces out. And Mom was so ticked because she was like, this is going to be a waste of their time as opposed to,
Would you read only educational books?
No. Hold on. But my point being is that, and this is why we give her grief, and maybe it went a little too far. But my point being is you can be intentional about everything you do. And it was a huge weight on her, but she was constantly being vigilant about, I don't want to be wasting my time doing something that talked about
Time on task.
And it wasn't necessarily, our school days were just the morning, right? But we were still learning stuff all through the afternoon because she was intentional about what we were exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
That's my point. You can play Candyland, Martin.
And you can read whatever books you want to.
Okay, good.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you all is because we've talked a lot on this podcast about being lifelong learners, but I admire you three because you're also lifelong teachers and you've been bringing people along for your whole life. So I enjoyed this conversation and hearing your advice for teachers. Thank you. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Classical Etc. If you'd like to show your support for the show, then you can leave a like below. If you'd like to add your voice to the conversation, then you can comment. And if you want to follow along with us on this journey, then please subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you later.